Recovery from brain surgery is not a dramatic thing. It is quiet and slow and deeply unglamorous. It is lying still for days at a time. It is having to ask for help with things you used to do without thinking. It is learning to be patient with your own healing. But inside that stillness, I was anything but quiet. I spent those weeks in recovery doing three things: resting, planning, and gathering every piece of my life back into my own hands. Claire stayed with me for the first 2 weeks. She slept in the guest room, brought me soup I didn't ask for, and watched old films with me in comfortable silence. She was the kind of friend that, when you're in the middle of the worst season of your life, you look at and think, this is why I survived. Marcus played the devoted husband with precision. He came home at reasonable hours during my recovery. He brought things I needed. He spoke to me gently. He was, in every outward way, the perfect picture of a man tending to his injured wife. I said nothing, I watched everything. Meanwhile, I had spoken to a lawyer, a quiet, sharp woman named Ms. Adami, who specialized in divorce and financial protection, and who listened to my full story without interrupting once. She helped me understand my rights. She helped me understand what I was entitled to. She helped me put together a plan that would not leave me exposed or alone when the time came. I also made a decision about my family. Because here is what I hadn't yet addressed, the part of this story that ran deeper and older than Marcus. My mother, my sister, the years of being called dramatic and sensitive and too much. The way my instincts had been overridden, my voice had been quieted, my pain had been managed instead of heard. I thought about how many times I had reached out to them during those dark months of symptoms and silence, and how both times they had, in their own way, pushed me back toward the person who was hurting me. Not intentionally, I believe, but carelessly, with the particular carelessness of people who have never had to question their own comfort. I wasn't angry at them the way I was angry at Marcus. His betrayal was deliberate. Theirs was laziness and self-protection, but I had decisions to make about what I would allow going forward. I wrote them letters, long ones, not sent, not yet. Just written in the same private document where I had written everything else. Because writing had always been how I sorted myself out, and I needed to be sorted out before I could act. 6 weeks after my surgery, I was cleared for normal activity. The day I was cleared, I made 3 calls. The first was to Ms. Adami. I told her it was time. The second was to Claire. I told her what I was about to do. She said, "Do you want me there?" I said, "No, this one I do alone." The third call I didn't make. Instead, I drove to the hospital where Marcus worked, arrived just before his lunch break, and sat in the waiting area of the main corridor where I knew he passed every day. He came through the doors in his white coat, relaxed, unhurried, laughing at something on his phone. I watched him for a moment before he saw me. I wanted to remember this, the last moment of him not knowing that everything was about to change. He looked up, saw me, smiled with the warmth of a man with a completely clear conscience. "Sarah, what are you doing here? You should be resting." "I'm fine," I said. "Can we talk somewhere quiet?" We found an empty consultation room down the hall. He closed the door. He leaned against the desk and crossed his arms, patient and attentive, performing the husband. I set the folder on the desk between us. He looked at it. "What is this?" "Open it." He did. I watched his face as he read. The shift was slow at first, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness where there had been ease. Then something fell. The performance dropped, piece by piece, like a set being dismantled. By the time he reached the final page, his jaw was tight and his hands were still, and he was not looking at me. "Sarah, I'm not here for an explanation," I said. "I don't need one, I know everything. It's not what it, Marcus." My voice was calm, genuinely calm. I surprised myself. I had brain surgery 6 weeks ago. I found out about this 12 days before I went under. I lay beside you every night between finding out and that surgery, and I said nothing because I needed to survive first. And I did, so now I'm here. He was quiet for a long moment. "The divorce papers will be served this week," I said. "Ms. Adami has everything. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I picked up the folder. I turned toward the door. Sarah, his voice was different now, stripped of performance, raw in a way I hadn't heard in years. I'm sorry. I stopped. I didn't turn around. I know you are, I said. But sorry doesn't give me back the months I spent believing I was going crazy. Sorry doesn't give me back the time I lost being dismissed when I should have been diagnosed. Sorry doesn't fix what you chose to do while I was fighting for my life. I opened the door. I hope you find whatever it is you were looking for, I said. I genuinely do. But you won't find it by taking it from me. And I walked out. The papers were served 3 days later. Marcus did not contest the process. I think some part of him understood that he didn't have the moral ground to stand on. The settlement was fair. Our house, my share of the assets, enough to rebuild. Ms. Adami was everything her reputation promised. Dr. Nadia Reeves, I later heard through the quiet network of mutual acquaintances, ended their relationship within a month of the divorce filing. I felt nothing about this. It was not my story to carry. My mother called when she found out. She was upset, which I had expected. She said I was making a mistake. She said marriages go through hard times and walking away was the easy thing, the selfish thing. She said I owed it to everyone who had been at that wedding to try harder. I let her finish. Then I said quietly, Mom, I had a brain tumor. I told you I was sick and you told me I was being dramatic. I need you to understand how much that hurt. And I need some time. She was silent for so long I thought she might hang up. Then she said in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, I didn't know, Sarah. I truly didn't know. I know, I said, but I needed you to believe me before you knew. That's the difference. We didn't speak for 2 months after that. It was hard, but it was necessary. Lily reached out on her own without being prompted. She came to my apartment. I was renting a small place downtown, bright windows, full bookshelves, mine entirely, and she sat on my kitchen floor and cried. Not polished tears, real ones. She said she was sorry she had dismissed me. She said she had been so wrapped up in her own life that she hadn't really listened. She said she didn't want to be the kind of person who wasn't there when her sister needed her. I forgave Lily that afternoon. Not because she asked, though she did, but because I could see that she meant it. And forgiveness, I was learning, was something I did for myself, not for the people I was forgiving. My mother and I found our way back to each other slowly. It took months of careful, honest conversations, the kind we had never really had before. She was not easy to talk to. She was defensive sometimes, and her instinct was still to protect the image of things rather than the truth of them. But she was trying, and I had learned to see trying as something. My father, quiet, gentle, armchair-reading dad, called me one evening and said simply, I should have paid more attention. I'm sorry, sweetheart. That made me cry. My recovery continued. The tumor, successfully removed, required follow-up scans every 6 months. Each one came back clear. With every clear scan, I felt my body return more fully to itself, stronger, more settled, more mine. I started writing again. Really writing, not just privately, not just to process, but with intention and purpose. I began documenting my story, the symptoms, the dismissals, the diagnosis. The affair and the divorce and the rebuilding. I wasn't sure what it would become, a book, a blog, a letter to no one, but the act of writing it felt like planting something. Eventually it became this, the story you're hearing now. Because here is what I want you to understand if you've come this far, if you've stayed with me through all of it. I was not weak for believing in people who let me down. I was not stupid for trusting when I shouldn't have. I was not dramatic for knowing that my own body was trying to tell me something. I was not too much for feeling everything deeply, for dreaming loudly, for filling journals under my bed with the private contents of my interior world. I was a woman who loved too generously and too unguardedly, and I paid a price for that. But I came through it. The tumor is gone. The marriage is gone. Some relationships are repaired, some are altered permanently, and a few, like Claire, always Claire, have grown stronger for everything they survived alongside me. I live in my bright apartment with its full bookshelves. I write every morning before the world fully wakes up in the golden quiet of early light. I have learned to take up space not loudly or aggressively but steadily. The way a tree takes up space, just by being there, just by growing, I am not angry anymore. That surprised me when I found it, the absence of anger. I expected to carry it for longer. But anger is heavy and I have enough to carry already, and at some point I simply put it down. Not because what happened was okay, it wasn't, but because I am not willing to spend the only life I have hauling the weight of other people's failures. Marcus made his choices, they were his to make. And I made mine. What I will never forgive, not him, not anyone, is the silence that surrounded my suffering when it could have been broken. The reflexive dismissal of a woman who kept saying something is wrong and was met, again and again, with "you're probably just anxious." That is the wound that took the longest to heal. That is the thing I carry most carefully now because it taught me the most important lesson of everything I went through: trust yourself, not blindly, not arrogantly, but in the deep, quiet, persistent way that says, I know my own body, I know my own mind, and when something is wrong, I am the first person who should be listened to. The strongest thing I ever did was not walking out of that hospital consultation room, though that took everything I had. The strongest thing I ever did was walking into the neurologist's office a second time, and a third time, and insisting, quietly, persistently, with my whole soft, stubborn heart, that I be taken seriously. That saved my life, not Marcus, not my mother, not the version of me that spent years making herself small to fit into spaces that were never built for her. Me, I saved my own life. And I'm still saving it. Every day I choose honesty over performance. Every day I choose my own instincts over someone else's comfort. Every day I sit at my desk in the early morning light and put words on a page that are entirely mine. That is my revenge, not dramatic, not cinematic, no confrontation scene worth filming. Just a woman who refused to disappear, who chose herself even when no one else did, who kept writing her own story even when others tried to write it for her. I finally understood. Sometimes the strongest revenge is living fully, honestly, unapologetically, and never letting anyone steal your light again. If this story reached you, if any part of it felt familiar, I want you to know your instincts are valid, your pain is real, and you are worth fighting for even if you have to fight for yourself. You are not too much, you are exactly enough. The word she used was meningioma, a tumor, sitting quietly at the base of my brain like an uninvited guest, slow growing, the doctor said, benign, she said, but real, undeniably, undeniably real. Not stress, not hormones, not anxiety, not me being dramatic or sensitive or too much, as I had been told my whole life by the people who were supposed to know me best. A tumor. I sat in that chair across from her, this quiet, steady woman with her reading glasses and her careful voice, and I felt something strange wash over me. Not just fear, though the fear was there, cold and immediate and real, but underneath the fear, something almost like relief. The deep, shuddering relief of a person who has been told over and over that what they are feeling is not real and has finally been believed. I had known. Deep in the part of me that never lied, I had known that something was wrong. And being believed, even by a scan, even by a small bright spot on a black image, felt like finally being heard after a very long silence. The neurologist explained everything carefully. The tumor was benign, not cancerous, but its position meant it needed to be monitored closely and likely removed. It explained the headaches that had been building for months, the dizziness, the strange softness at the edges of my vision, the trembling in my hands that I had spent weeks trying to hide. Everything I had described, everything I had been dismissed for, explained in one quiet appointment by a woman who had simply listened. I drove home alone. The autumn leaves were turning outside my window, gold and red and amber, the world performing its most beautiful season as if nothing had shifted. I remember gripping the steering wheel and thinking how surreal it was to have your life crack open on an ordinary Thursday afternoon while the trees outside looked like something from a painting. I called Marcus from the parking lot before I left. He answered on the third ring. I could hear the hospital behind him, the low hum of movement, the distant beeping of monitors, the particular white noise of a place where urgent things happened all the time. They found something, I said. My voice was steady. I don't know how. A pause. What do you mean, found something? On the MRI, a tumor, Marcus, a meningioma. That's what's been causing everything, the headaches, the dizziness, all of it. It's real. It's been real this whole time. Silence. A longer silence than I expected. Sarah, his voice was careful. Measured, practiced, though I wouldn't call it that until later. Let's not panic. These things are often benign. It is benign, she told me that. But Marcus, I've been telling everyone something was wrong for months. You told me it was stress. You told me it was the fertility treatments. A pause. I was working from what I could observe. I didn't have the scans, I know, I said, and I did know, or I told myself I did. I just need you to come home early tonight, please. He came home with flowers, pale pink roses, my favorite. He held me in the kitchen while I finally let myself cry. Not the careful, controlled crying I had been allowing myself in private, the kind that didn't leave marks. Real crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and formless and long compressed. All the fear and exhaustion and months of not being believed pouring out of me at once while he held my head against his chest and stroked my hair and said, I'm here, I've got you. We'll face this together. For one night I felt like we were us again, but the next morning he was gone before I woke up. The surgery consultation was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks I tried to hold myself steady. I focused on the practical things, the pre-surgical appointments, the consultations, the paperwork and the questions and the logistics of preparing your body and your home for a procedure that required cutting into the most delicate part of you. I made lists, I organized, I did what I had always done when I was frightened, I channeled it into motion. But underneath all of it, something was pulling at me, a thread I kept trying not to follow. His phone was always face down on the table, always. I noticed it the way you notice something that has always been there but suddenly reads differently, like a word you've seen 1,000 times that one day looks strange and foreign. Face down. On the kitchen counter, on the coffee table, on his nightstand, always face down, always taken into the bathroom, the evenings stretched longer. He was a surgeon, late nights were part of his life, had always been, but these were different late nights. I couldn't have explained how I knew that, I just knew. The way you know a silence has a different quality than simply the absence of sound. And then there was the name. It happened on a Tuesday evening. He had left his phone on the counter while he went upstairs to change, and it lit up with a message, and before I could look away, before I even decided whether I wanted to look, I caught it. A name, Nadia, just that, one word and a preview that disappeared before I could read anything else. I stood there, looking at the dark screen, thinking, who is Nadia? He had mentioned a doctor. Nadia Reeves once, months ago, a cardiologist at his hospital. Young, brilliant, his words. I had filed it away as a colleague, nothing more, I told myself nothing more. I went upstairs and I lay down on the bed and I stared at the ceiling and I let the thought move through me and out the other side, and I decided consciously, deliberately, that I was not going to become the kind of woman who read her husband's messages. I was facing brain surgery. I needed to focus on what I could control. So I went back downstairs and I asked if he wanted dinner and he said, sure, and we ate together at the kitchen table and I watched his hands, those surgeon's hands. Steady and precise, and I thought, I know this person. I have known him for 9 years, I would know. I was so good at talking myself out of the truth. Claire came over the following Saturday. She arrived with coffee and the quiet purposefulness of someone who has been rehearsing what they're about to say for several days. I knew her well enough to recognize it, the slight tension in her jaw, the way she set the cups down too carefully, the way her eyes kept finding mine and then sliding away. We sat at my kitchen table. I wrapped my hands around the cup. I looked at her. Tell me, I said. She looked at me. How did you, Claire, tell me? She took a breath. I saw Marcus last week. At Rosario's? She watched my face as she said it. Rosario's, a restaurant 40 minutes from town, the kind of place that was specifically far away enough to mean something. He wasn't alone. The kitchen went very quiet. Outside the window, a neighbor's child was playing, their laughter carried on the autumn air. I heard it very clearly, the way you hear small, ordinary things with great sharpness when the large things have gone silent. He was with a woman, Claire said, her voice dropping. And Sarah, I stood there for over a minute. He never saw me. I watched them. They were not having a work dinner. They were not colleagues. She paused. I'm so sorry. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, whether to tell you before the surgery. I didn't know what to do. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I had expected to cry, or to feel the floor give way beneath me, or to have some dramatic physical reaction to what I was hearing. Instead, I felt something cold and very clear move through me, the way cold air moves through an open window, sharp and clarifying, sweeping everything into sudden focus. How long have you known? I asked. I only just saw them, I promise, last Saturday. I nodded slowly. Sarah, say something? Thank you, I said. For telling me. She reached across the table and took my hand. I let her hold it. And we sat like that for a long time, in the kitchen where I had made 100 dinners and had 100 ordinary evenings, and built what I thought was a life. While outside, the neighbor's child kept laughing. I did not confront Marcus that night, or the next night. I lay beside him in our bed, this man who had held me while I cried over my tumor, who had said, I've got you, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark, and I let myself do something I had been refusing to do for months. I looked back, really looked, at every moment I had smoothed over or explained away or chosen not to see, the late nights, the phone face down, the careful distances that had grown between us like slow-rising water, so gradual that each individual inch seemed like nothing. But now, looking back from above, I could see how deep it had gotten. The way he had, over months, stopped being present even when he was physically there. The way our conversations had become functional rather than intimate, logistics, schedules, medical updates. The way he had called me dramatic. The way he had, with such calm and professional authority, redirected my very real physical symptoms toward anxiety and stress, and the mental health consequences of fertility treatment failure. And then, a thought I had pushed away the first time it arrived. I let myself ask the question I had been too frightened to form: had he known? Had some part of him, with his medical training and his intimate knowledge of my symptoms, had some part of him known, or suspected, that something was actually physically wrong? Had it been more convenient to have me believe I was falling apart emotionally than to pursue the truth? I pushed it down. It was too dark. I wasn't ready for it, but it came back. It always came back. I hired a private investigator. I am not ashamed of this. I was a woman with a brain tumor and a crumbling marriage and a husband who came home with flowers and said, I've got you, and then took his phone into the bathroom. I needed the truth in a form that could not be reframed, in a form that required no interpretation, no benefit of the doubt, no room for me to talk myself out of what I was seeing. I needed facts. The investigator was professional and discreet. He asked questions. I answered them. He told me he would have a preliminary report within 10 to 14 days. In those 2 weeks, I kept my face composed. I made dinners. I attended my pre-surgical appointments, sometimes with Marcus, sometimes alone. I answered his questions about how I was feeling. I smiled when smiling was called for. I was learning, for the first time in my life, to keep my interior life entirely hidden from the person closest to me. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent our entire marriage being transparent to the point of vulnerability, wearing everything on my face, unable to conceal what I felt. And now, when it mattered most, I had become still, unreadable, a version of myself I didn't entirely recognize. The report arrived on a Wednesday, 12 days before my surgery. I opened it alone at the kitchen table while Marcus was at the hospital. Dr. Nadia Reeves, 31 years old, cardiologist. She and Marcus had been seeing each other, the investigator's careful, clinical word, chosen with professional distance, for 14 months. 14 months. I read the number and I sat with it. I let it settle into me fully rather than skimming past it. 14 months. I counted backwards. 14 months ago, I had been in the middle of my second round of fertility treatments. I had been injecting hormones every morning at the kitchen sink, crying quietly so Marcus wouldn't hear, telling myself that this time it would work, this time would be different. This time, all the pain would become something worth it. 14 months ago, I had been in waiting rooms with paper gowns and too bright lights, and that specific brand of hope that is so exhausted it barely resembles hope anymore. And while I was doing that, while I was quite literally trying to build a life with this man, he was building something else, somewhere else, with someone else. I put the folder down. I looked at my hands on the table. They were completely still. I thought about every time I had told him I was frightened. Every time I had described a symptom and watched him offer a measured, reassuring, completely deflecting response. Every time I had said something is wrong and he had said you're under a lot of stress, Sarah, and I had accepted that because he was a doctor, because he knew things I didn't. Because some part of me had been trained since childhood to trust the authority of other people's certainty over the quieter voice of my own. And then I thought slowly, because my mind was moving carefully now, picking its way through each step like crossing a frozen river, I thought about the timeline. The symptoms had begun roughly 14 to 16 months ago. Around the same time the affair started, I had reported them. He had heard them described in detail. He had, with all his medical training and all his knowledge of neurology and neurosurgery, gently and consistently pointed me away from them. I will never know with certainty whether that was conscious, whether he knew or suspected and chose the easier path. Whether it was deliberately self-serving or simply, and this almost makes it worse, whether he was so consumed by his other life that he genuinely wasn't listening, I will never know. But I know what it cost me. Months of my life spent believing I was losing my mind rather than healing my body. Months of diminished self-trust, of second-guessing my own perceptions, of quietly internalizing the message from him, from my mother, from my sister. From everyone I trusted that I was too anxious, too sensitive, too much. Months of a tumor sitting inside my skull while the people around me called it stress. That is what I know. I told no one what I had found, not yet. My surgery was 12 days away. I needed to be calm. I needed to be focused. I needed every bit of my energy directed toward surviving what was coming, not toward the secondary devastation waiting for me on the other side of it. So I did something I had always done in the worst moments of my life. I wrote. I opened my laptop and I started at the beginning. Not a journal entry, not the private, rambling kind I used to fill those stacked notebooks under my bed. Something different, something precise and intentional. I wrote the symptoms. I wrote the dates. I wrote every dismissal, every redirection, every appointment where I had been sent home with a pat on the hand and a suggestion to manage my anxiety. I wrote the tumor and the diagnosis and the name on the phone screen and the report in the folder and 14 months. I wrote it all down, plainly and in order, so that it existed somewhere outside my own head. So that it was real in the way that words on a page are real, visible, undeniable, permanent. When I finished, my hands were steady. The chaos in my chest had compressed itself into something I could hold. I had a surgery to get through. I would get through it. And then I would deal with the rest. The surgery happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I arrived at the hospital at 6 in the morning while it was still dark outside, the streets quiet, the air cold and clean. I changed into the hospital gown. I answered the intake questions. A nurse checked my vitals and made a small note on my chart and told me the surgeon would see me shortly. I lay on the gurney in the pre-op room and I looked at the ceiling tiles and I thought, I am going to be okay, not as a prayer, not as desperate self-reassurance, just as a fact I had decided. I was going to survive this. I had not come this far through the months of dismissal, through the discovery that had fractured everything. Through the silent 12 days of keeping my face composed at the dinner table, I had not come through all of that to be defeated on a Tuesday morning in October. The anesthesiologist came in, we spoke briefly. He had kind eyes. And then, just before they wheeled me in, I looked at the door and I noticed that the person standing in the frame was not Marcus. It was Claire. She had driven 40 minutes in the dark to be there before I went under. She stood in the doorway in her coat with her hair still half undone from rushing, and she looked at me and she said, "I'm here, you've got this." I reached out my hand. She took it. "Where's Marcus?" the nurse asked, gently looking at her clipboard. Running late, I said, "It's fine." It wasn't fine, but it was true. I was fine. I was completely and quietly fine in a way that had nothing to do with Marcus, nothing to do with anyone who had let me down or looked away or chosen their own comfort over my truth. I was fine because I was still here, I was still fighting, I was still, after everything, choosing to survive. He arrived 43 minutes later. I know this because Claire told me afterward. By that time, I was already in surgery. He was there when I woke up, eventually, slightly breathless, apologies already forming on his lips. "Emergency with a patient," he said. He couldn't get away sooner. I looked at him from my hospital bed, groggy and bandaged and more clear-eyed than I had been in over a year. I looked at this man I had loved for 9 years, this man who had sat with me in a coffee shop for 4 hours on a Saturday morning and made me feel, for the first time, truly seen. I looked at the pale pink roses he had brought. I looked at the careful concern in his face. And I thought, "I see you now, all of you, finally all of you. How are you feeling?" he asked. His voice was warm and tender and performed with such precision that a year ago I would have believed every note of it. "Better," I said, and smiled. "Much better." He reached for my hand. I let him take it because I had a plan now, and plans require patience. And I had learned these past 12 days that I was more patient than I had ever known. I was going to recover. I was going to gather my strength. I was going to rebuild myself from the inside out, quietly and completely, in the private interior space that belonged to no one but me. And then, when I was ready, when I was strong and clear and standing fully in my own truth, I was going to burn every false thing to the ground. Not with rage. Not with the messy, consuming heat of someone who has been broken. With calm, with evidence, with the precise, unhurried certainty of a woman who finally, after 32 years, believed herself. Until everything changed, I realized that the person I trusted most was the one who destroyed me. There are moments in life that split everything in two, the before and the after. The version of you that existed before the truth and the one that had to learn how to breathe again once it was revealed. This is my before and after. My name is Sarah. And for 32 years, I believed I was loved. I grew up in a small, quiet town where everybody knew everybody, where the smell of fresh bread from Mrs. Patterson's bakery drifted through the streets every Sunday morning, and where the sound of church bells meant the whole neighborhood would slow down, just for a moment, and remember what mattered. It was the kind of town that looked beautiful in photographs, the kind of town that made you feel safe, but safety, I would later learn, is sometimes just a beautiful lie. I was the middle child of 3. My older brother Daniel was the golden one, tall, confident, the kind of person who walked into a room and made everyone turn their head. My younger sister Lily was the baby, adored by everyone, wrapped in a softness that the rest of us never quite received. And then there was me, Sarah, the quiet one. The one who read too many books, felt too many things, and never quite knew how to take up space the way the others did. My mother, Grace, was a woman of appearances. She kept the house immaculate, her hair always set, her smile always perfect for company. She was the kind of mother who would bake cookies for the school fundraiser but forget to ask how your day was. She loved us, I believe that. But her love had conditions attached that I was too young to read. My father, Robert, was gentler. He had soft eyes and a deep laugh, and on Sunday evenings he would sit in his armchair and read while I curled up on the floor beside him, just to be near someone who felt safe. He was my anchor in a house that sometimes felt like it was drifting. I was a dreamer. I wanted to be a writer. I used to fill journals one after another, stacking them under my bed like secrets. Stories about other worlds, other lives, other versions of myself who were bolder and brighter and less afraid. Writing was the one place I never had to apologize for feeling too much. Then I met Marcus. I was 23, fresh out of university, working a small editorial job at a local magazine, still carrying those journals, still dreaming. He walked into the coffee shop where I used to write on Saturday mornings, and he sat down at the table next to mine, and he looked at what I was doing, really looked, and he said, "Is that a story or a diary?" I laughed. Both, I said. He smiled like that was the most interesting answer he'd ever heard. We talked for 4 hours that morning. About books, about dreams, about the strange loneliness of being someone who feels everything deeply in a world that rewards people who feel nothing. He was a doctor, a resident at the time, working impossible hours, carrying the weight of other people's lives on his shoulders every single day. He was brilliant and tired and kind, and when he looked at me, I felt like someone had finally turned the lights on in a room I'd been sitting in the dark. We were engaged within 2 years. The wedding was everything my mother had always imagined: white roses, a string quartet, 200 guests. She cried during the vows not because she was moved, I realized later, but because she had finally achieved what she'd been curating all along: the perfect family portrait. Marcus and I moved into a beautiful house on the edge of town. He had his practice. I had my writing. We had each other. For the first 3 years, I thought I had finally arrived at the life I was supposed to have. We tried for a baby almost immediately. It was something we both wanted, or so I believed. Month after month, nothing happened. The doctors ran tests. Everything came back fine on both sides. Unexplained infertility, they said, which is just a clinical way of saying, we don't know why your heart keeps breaking. I threw myself into fertility treatments, injections, hormones. Endless appointments. I charted everything, tracked everything, hoped everything. Marcus was supportive at first. He held my hand in waiting rooms. He made me tea when I cried. He told me it would happen, but somewhere in that second year of trying, something shifted. It was small things at first, the kind of things you talk yourself out of noticing. He started working later. He stopped reaching for my hand. He would come home and go straight to his office, and when I knocked on the door and asked if he wanted dinner, he would say, "In a bit," and that bit would stretch into hours. I told myself he was tired. He was a doctor. Tired was his default state. I told my mother. She patted my hand and said, "All marriages go through phases, Sarah. Stop being dramatic." I told my sister Lily. She said, "Marcus is wonderful. You're probably just anxious from all the fertility stuff. It messes with your hormones." I told my best friend Claire. She was the only one who looked at me carefully and said, "Are you okay? Really okay?" And I didn't know how to answer that, so I just said yes. Because I wanted to be okay, I needed to be okay. So I convinced myself I was. The treatments continued. My body began to feel like a science experiment, bloated and bruised and exhausted and hopeful all at once. I was injecting hormones every morning, swallowing supplements, cutting out caffeine and alcohol and anything that might interfere with the fragile possibility of life. I was doing everything right. And then the headaches started. At first I thought they were from the hormones. My doctor adjusted the dosage. The headaches continued. Then came the dizziness, sudden, disorienting spells that would hit me in the middle of the day and leave me gripping the edge of a counter or a wall, waiting for the world to stop spinning. I started dropping things. My hands would tremble sometimes, just slightly, just enough to make me look down at them like they belonged to someone else. I went to my GP. She ran blood tests. Everything was normal, she said. Probably stress, she said. The fertility treatments were hard on the body. Had I considered therapy? I was already going, but the symptoms didn't stop. They got worse. One evening I was cooking dinner when my vision went blurry, not completely, not dramatically, just enough that the edges of things went soft and uncertain. I put down the knife I was holding. I sat on the kitchen floor, and I thought very quietly, something is wrong with me. I told Marcus that night. He looked at me across the dinner table and he said, carefully, calmly, "Sarah, I think you're letting the stress get to you. You've been under enormous pressure. The fertility treatments, the hormones, your body and mind are both exhausted. I really think you should talk to someone." "I am talking to someone," I said. "I'm talking to you." He smiled. That patient practice smile, I mean a professional. I already had a therapist. But after that conversation, I began to wonder, was he right? Was I imagining things? Was the anxiety, the grief of trying and failing to conceive month after month, was it manifesting physically? Was I creating symptoms out of fear? My therapist didn't think so. She said my symptoms sounded physical and I should push for more testing. My mother thought I was being a hypochondriac. My sister said I needed to relax and let things happen naturally. Marcus scheduled me an appointment with a colleague, a neurologist, he said, just to rule things out, just to give me peace of mind. I went alone. Marcus had a surgery that day. He couldn't cancel it. The neurologist was a quiet woman with reading glasses and steady hands. She examined me thoroughly, asked detailed questions, ordered an MRI and a full blood panel. She said she'd have results within the week. I drove home alone. The autumn leaves were turning outside the window, gold and amber and red, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could look so beautiful when you felt so uncertain inside. That week was one of the longest of my life. Marcus was distant, not unkind, never unkind, not outwardly, but absent. Present in the house, but somewhere else entirely, like a photograph of a person rather than the person themselves. I found myself watching him sometimes, trying to locate the man I had married and the man sitting across from me. The man who had sat with me in that coffee shop for 4 hours and made me feel for the first time
You love to remind me no matter what I do.
I told myself
But you lost in a break, cause you have been traded. So I send you a bouquet, saying it's a mistake. Dream my travels away, when my glass of champagne. And you know, I'm the first to say that I'm not perfect. And you're the first to say you want the best thing. But now I know the perfect way to let you go. Give my last and love this morning. I'm the first to say that I'm not perfect. And you're the first to say you want the best thing. And now I know the perfect way to let you go. Give my last and love this morning. Sing but now I know the perfect way to let you go. Give my last and love
But what I didn't
this
know that day would
morning.
change everything I thought I knew about him.